Along the coast road by the headland, the early lights of winter glow.
The depth to which surface waves affect a water body is referred to as wave base, and on continental shelves, two levels can be distinguished. The fair weather wave base is the depth to which there is a wave-influenced motion under normal weather conditions. The storm wave base is the depth waves reach when the surface waves have a higher energy due to stronger winds driving them. Below the storm wave base, the seabed is not normally affected by surface waves. Storms are weather systems that have associated strong surface winds, typically in excess of 100 kilometers an hour, and they may affect both land and marine environments. In continental settings, they are important in aeolian transport of material that includes the transport of airborne sediment out into the oceans. Large storms have a very large impact in shallow marine environments, and storm-related processes of sedimentation are dominant in most shelf and epicontinental seas. There are three components to the effects of storms on shelf environments. The strongest winds drive currents in the oceans that move water and sediment across and along continental shelves. They also generate large waves that affect much deeper parts of the shelves than normal fair weather waves. These waves rework the sediment on the seafloor, generating characteristic sedimentary structures. Lastly, the high energy conditions bring a lot of sediment into suspension near the seafloor, and the mixture of sediment and water moves as a gravity-driven underflow across the shelf from shallower to deeper water. The deposits of these storm processes are referred to as tempestites. Tsunami is a Japanese word for harbor wave and refers to waves with periods of 10 to the third to 10 to the fourth seconds that are generated by events such as subsea earthquakes, large volcanic eruptions, and submarine landslides. In the past, such waves were sometimes incorrectly called tidal waves, but their origins have no connection with tidal forces. This is incorrect. These events can set up a surface wave a few tens of centimeters in amplitude in the deep ocean water and a wavelength of many kilometers. As the wave reaches the shallower waters of the continental shelf, the amplitude is increased to 10 or more meters, producing a wave that can have a devastating effect on coastal areas, resulting in the death of hundreds of thousands of people. The effects of a tsunami can be dramatic, with widespread destruction occurring near coasts, both near the source of the wave and also anywhere in the path of it, which can be thousands of kilometers away across the ocean. They also have a serious impact on shallow water marine environments, causing disruption and redeposition of foreshore and shore-face sediment. It's been suggested that beds of poorly sorted debris containing a mixture of deposits and fauna from different coastal and shallow marine environments may form as a consequence of a tsunami. It may be possible to distinguish them from ordinary storm deposits by their larger size, but in practice it may be difficult to show that a deposit is generated by a specific mechanism. We've done a little bit of work on this in the isotope lab where we're using mollusks to determine whether a tempestite is generated by a tsunami or a storm. Currents that are driven by contrast in temperature and or salinity are called thermohaline currents. Cold water is dense and will sink relative to warm water, with seawater being denser if the salinity is greater than normal. These temperature and salinity contrasts generate flow of the denser fluid beneath the less dense water. Cold surface water descends at high polar latitudes. The North Atlantic deep water and Antarctic bottom water then form water masses that move around the oceans as thermohaline bottom currents. The water that is moved from the polar regions is replaced by warm surface waters, and this sets up a circulation system that transports water thousands of kilometers in the world's oceans. Geostrophic currents are wind-driven currents related to the global wind systems that result from differences in air mass temperatures combined with the Coriolis effect. The result is the pattern of ocean currents shown here. The effects of these currents on sedimentation are most noticeable in deeper waters, as their effects in shallower water are often masked by the influence of tides, waves, and storms. Thermohaline currents are typically weaker than storm and tidal currents, but are of larger volume. They mainly move clay and silt in suspension and very fine sands as bedload. Thermohaline currents are also important in the distribution of nutrients in the oceans. Bottom currents move nutrients from colder regions to areas where upwelling occurs and the nutrient-rich waters again reach the surface. As a consequence, these areas of upwelling are regions of high organic productivity that can result in deposits rich in biogenic material. The most important chemical and biochemical sediment in modern seas and ancient shelf deposits are carbonate sediment and evaporites. In the ocean, plankton generate large quantities of carbonate and siliceous sediment. In addition, there are other less abundant but significant chemical and biochemical deposits. The term glauconite is commonly used by geologists to refer to a dark green mineral that is found quite commonly in marine sediments. In proper usage, this term should be restricted to potassium-rich mica, which has the mineral name glauconite, because this is in fact only one member of a group of potassium and iron-rich phyllosilicates that are closely related. Material made up of any of these distinctive medium to dark green minerals is referred to as glaucony. Glaucony minerals are authigenic, which means they crystallize within the sedimentary environment. This is in contrast to almost all other silicate minerals found within sediments that are detrital. The process of forming the mineral, glauconization, occurs at the seafloor on substrates such as the hard parts of foraminifera, other carbonate fragments, fecal pellets, and lithic fragments. It appears the process requires a particular microenvironment at the interface between oxidizing seawater and slightly reducing interstitial waters. This typically occurs at water depths between about 50 and 500 meters on the outer parts of continental shelves and the upper parts of continental slopes. Glaucony and glauconite are important in sedimentology and stratigraphy for a number of reasons. Firstly, they're a reliable indicator of deposition in a shallow marine environment, although it can be reworked into deeper water and occasionally into shallower environments by currents. Secondly, it is most abundant within shelf sediments under conditions where sedimentation of other material, terrigenous clastics, or carbonate is slow. It therefore commonly occurs in condensed sections, strata that have been deposited at anomalously slow sedimentation rates. The recognition of periods of low sedimentation rate on the shelf is important when assessing evidence of changes in sea level because outer shelf sedimentation tends to be slowest during periods of sea level rise. Thirdly, because the mineral is authigenic and also rich in potassium, it can be dated by radiometric methods with the age corresponding to the time of deposition. Direct radiometric dating of sedimentary material is rarely possible, but with glaucony and glauconite as an exception, it's consequently very important in relating strata to the geologic timescale. Phosphorites are sedimentary rocks that are enriched in phosphorus to a level where their bulk composition is over 15% P2O5, phosphorus pentoxide. Phosphate may be present in sediment as primary bioclast such as fish teeth and scales and vertebrate bones, but mostly it occurs as an authigenic precipitate that coats grains, forms peloids and micronodules on the seafloor, perhaps also occurring as laminae encrusting the seabed. Accumulations of phosphorate are favored by slow sedimentation rates of other materials and, like glaucony, are characteristic of condensed sections. Hard grounds can be composed of laminated phosphorites, while the peloids and other grains are concentrated into phosphate-rich beds by reworking of the material via seafloor currents. Modern phosphorite concentrations occur in continental margins where there are regions of upwelling of nutrient-rich waters, such as off the west coast of South America and off West Africa where Antarctic water comes to the surface. These nutrient-rich cool waters coming up into warmer waters promote blooms of plankton that are at the bottom of the food chain. Ancient phosphorites are thought to have formed in similar settings, and it might also be expected that concentrations would be greatest at times of high sea level when the supply of other sediment to the shelf is reduced. Phosphorite production is also related to the supply of phosphate, which ultimately comes from the weathering of continental rocks. Organic matter from dead plants, animals, and microbial organisms is abundant in the oceans and becomes part of the material that falls to the sea floor. Where the sea floor is oxygenated by currents bringing water down from the surface, the organic matter is oxidized or consumed by scavengers living on the seabed. Poor circulation reduces the oxygen in these waters at the seafloor, and the conditions can become anoxic. Breakdown of organic matter is slower or non-existent in the absence of oxygen, and therefore the conditions are not favorable for scavenging organisms. The organic matter accumulates under these anoxic conditions and contributes to the pelagic sediment to form black shale, a mud rock that typically contains 1 to 15% organic carbon by weight. The black or dark gray color is partly due to the presence of organic matter and also because of finely disseminated pyrite and iron sulfide that forms under these reducing conditions. The conditions for the formation of black shales are therefore determined by the organic input, the efficiency of the breakdown of that material by microbial activity, and the dilution effects of terrigenous clastic, biogenic carbonate, or silica. The most favorable sites are therefore deep seas where there's poor circulation between the oxygenated surface water and the seafloor. Basins with restricted circulation, such as the modern Black Sea, provide optimal conditions, but not all black shales form in similar settings. Provided that the supply of organic material is greater than the rate at which it can be broken down, black shales can form on shelves where circulation is moderately effective. They can have considerable economic importance in sedimentology and stratigraphy, as they are hydrocarbon source rocks. Shelves are areas of oxygenated waters periodically swept by currents to bring in nutrients. As such, they're habitable environments for many organisms that may live swimming in water, known as planktonic organisms, or living on the seafloor, known as benthic organisms, either on the surface of that sediment or within the sediment. Plants and animals living in the marine realm contribute detritus, modify other sediments, and create their own environments. Modern shelf environments teem with life, and it's rare to find an ancient shelf deposit that does not contain some evidence for the organisms that lived in the seas at that time. In shallow seas with low clastic input, the calcareous hard parts of dead organisms make up the bulk of the sediment, either as loose detritus of mobile animals or as biogenic reefs that are whole sediment bodies built up as a framework by organisms such as coral and algae. Terrigenous clastic sandy and muddy shelf deposits may also contain a rich flora and fauna, the type and diversity of which depends on the energy of the seabed, with fragmentation occurring in high-energy environments, along with the post-depositional history that affects preservation of the material. Many plants and animals occupy ecological niches that are defined by such factors as water depth, temperature, nutrient supply, nature of substrate, and so on. If the ecological niche of a fossil organism can be determined, this can provide an excellent indication of the depositional environment. In younger Cenozoic strata, fossils may be organisms so similar to those alive today that determining the likely environment in which they lived is quite straightforward. The word Holocene means all life or whole life, and it implies a period of time in which most or nearly all organisms that existed from the beginning of the Holocene to the present are the same. Further back in geologic time, this task becomes more difficult. Groups of organisms, such as trilobites and graptolites, that were abundant in lower Paleozoic seas, have no modern representatives for direct comparison of lifestyle. Clues as to the ecological niche occupied by a fossil organism are provided by considering the functional morphology of the body fossil. All organisms are in some way adapted to their environment, such that these adaptations can be recognized as the lifestyle of the organism can be determined to some extent. In trilobites, for example, it has been noted that some types have well-developed eyes, whereas others have poorly developed eyes. An interpretation of this would be that trilobites with eyes needed them to help them move around on the seafloor, whereas those that lived buried in the sediment had no need for such eyesight. Some organisms are thought to have occupied very specific niches and can provide quite precise information about the environment of deposition. Some algae and hermatypic corals require clear water and sunlight to thrive, such that they are indicators of shallow, mud-free shelf environments. Other organisms, including certain bivalves, are much more tolerant of different environments and can live in a range of conditions and water depths, provided that a supply of nutrients is available. In general, the abundance of benthic organisms decreases as water depth increases. Shoreface environments usually have the most diverse assemblage of benthic fauna and flora due to the well-oxygenated conditions of the wave-agitated water and the availability of light, as long as it's not too muddy. The abundance of organisms living on the seafloor decreases in the offshore transition and offshore parts of the shelf. In the deep oceans, only a few specialized organisms live in areas outside of areas of hydrothermal activity. The abundance of planktonic organisms is controlled by the supply of nutrients and the temperature of surface water. The hard parts of planktonic organisms may be distributed in sediments of any water depth, although dissolution of calcium carbonate tends to occur in very deep water. One approach to the problem of determining depth at which sediment was deposited is to consider the ratio of benthic to planktonic organisms present. If the proportion of benthic organisms is high, the water was probably shallow, whereas a high count of planktonic organisms indicates deeper water. This seems a little counterintuitive at first. This method normally only provides a very rough guide to relative water depth, but is applied in a semi-quantitative way in Cenozoic and Mesozoic strata by considering the proportions of benthic and planktonic forms of foraminifera. Although body fossils provide physical evidence of an organism having lived in the past, trace fossils are evidence of the activity of the organism. Traces include tracks of walking animals, trails of worms, burrows of mollusks and crustaceans, collectively known as ichnofauna. Trace fossils are usually found on or within sediment that was unconsolidated, but with sufficient strength to retain the shape of the animal's trace. Contrasts in sediment type between a burrow and the host sediment are a considerable aid to recognition. A distinction is made between burrows formed in soft sediment and borings made by organisms into hard substrate. The different forms of trace fossils are given names similar to those used in the classification of animals and body fossils. For example, small vertical tubes in sand are called scolites, and a crawling trail produced by a multi-limbed organism is known as Cruziana. Comparison of the form of Cruziana traces with body fossils provides very strong evidence that trilobites made these features, but this link between ichnofauna and body fossils is the exception rather than the rule. For the majority of trace fossils, we can only guess at the nature of the animal that formed them. Other examples include the Ophiomorpha, a pellet-lined burrow which has a morphology identical to burrows made in modern callianacid shrimps, and Trepanites, a boring made into rock or solid substrate that can be seen in modern seas as being made by bivalve mollusks such as Lithophasia, or rock eaters. Ichnofossils are classified according to the inferred manner in which they were formed, such as the movement of an animal over a surface, feeding behavior of that animal, the creation of a shelter, and so on. However, there's considerable variation within these categories, with dinosaur footprints and trilobite tracks classified as the same type of trace fossil. There is also significant overlap between categories. An animal may have been walking and feeding at the same time. The most common trace fossils are some form of burrow made for dwelling, feeding, or both. Escape burrows formed by organisms moving up to the surface are common in settings where there's a rapid sedimentation by storms or turbidity currents. Basically, they got buried alive and they escaped by blasting upward. Although we may not know the identity of many of the animals that produce trace fossils, their presence provides some valuable information about the behavior of these organisms and the nature of their paleoenvironments. From the perspective of the analysis of sedimentary rocks, ichnofossils will often be more useful than fossil shells or bones because they are conclusive evidence that an animal lived there, rather than the other materials being transported. In contrast, a body fossil is a dead animal, and we can't always be sure that it lived where it was found. A coral may be preserved as a part of a reef in which it lived, but a pelagic organism is not preserved where it lived, swimming in the open ocean rather than on the ocean floor where it ended up after it died. In some cases, the environmental conditions might have actually caused the death of an animal, such as a skeleton of a mammal enclosed in volcanic ash, or a Lagerstätten. More importantly, ichnofauna provide precise information about the environment where they were formed. For example, bird footprints are either evidence of a land surface or a very shallow water where the bird may have been paddling, and a complex of burrows and seafloor sediment is evidence of oxygenated conditions. Trace fossils are therefore a very powerful tool in paleoenvironmental analysis, and we can use changes in trace fossil assemblages, known as ichnofacies, as evidence for changes in environment, such as the rise and fall of sea level. The ecology of the seafloor, and hence ichnofauna found in the sediment, is controlled by a number of interrelated factors. These factors are as follows. 1. Substrate type, whether it's hard or soft, sandy or muddy. 2. The strength of the currents that sweep the sea floor. 3. The rate at which sediment is deposited. 4. Turbidity, the amount of fine suspended sediment in the water. 5. Oxygen levels of the water. 6. The salinity of the water. 7. The quality of the nutrient supply. And 8. The quantity of the nutrient supply. These environmental variables can be simplified into a scheme based predominantly on water depth and the hardness of the substrate. Shallow marine environments tend to be higher energy and are richer in nutrients than deep water settings. There are, however, exceptions to this. Some shallow water settings, including shelf seas with a restricted circulation and lagoons, can be low energy and relatively poorly supplied with nutrients. Therefore, these ichnofacies are not necessarily definitive indicators of water depth. The conditions of the substrate may vary from loose sand in a foreshore setting to hard rocks in another beach environment. The ichnofacies that occur in hard or semi-consolidated shorelines, Trepanites and Glossofungites assemblages respectively, can also occur further out on the shelf if conditions result in a hard or firm seafloor. It should be noted that the names of the assemblages are taken from one particular ichnofossil that may be typical. The Cruziana assemblage does not necessarily include the actual form Cruziana, and is in fact unlikely to include that unless the deposits are Paleozoic, as they're thought to be formed by trilobites. Trace fossil assemblages that occur along shorelines may be subdivided according to the degree of consolidation of the substrate. Along sandy shorelines, Scolithus ichnofacies are characteristic. This facies is named after simple, vertical tubes formed by organisms that lived in the high energy region of the foreshore. In this assemblage, Ophiomorpha also occur, a larger, mainly vertical burrow lined with fecal pellets, and Diplocraterion, a U-shaped burrow. The animals that form Scolithus, Ophiomorpha, and Diplocraterion are thought to have moved up and down in the sediment with the changing water level of the foreshore. Where the sediment is semi-consolidated, the Glossofungates ichnofacies assemblage occurs. The burrows are similar to those formed of the Scolithus assemblage, but they tend to have sharp, well-defined margins to the tubes and may extend into excavated dwelling cavities. Some organisms, such as bivalves, echinoids, and a few sponges, are able to bore into rock to create dwelling traces. This assemblage is called Trypanites. In the shore face zone of the shelf, the Cruziana assemblage includes Cruziana itself, Rhizocorallium, an inclined U-shaped burrow, Chondrites, a vertical branching small burrow, Planolites, a horizontal branching burrow, and Thalassinoides, larger than 10 millimeter diameter burrows in a complex three-dimensional network. In the deeper waters of the outer bathyl zone, the Zoophycus assemblage is the characteristic Ichnofacies. Zoophycus has a rather variable, partly radial form that may be tens of centimeters across. Few other trace fossils are found in these depths. In the deeper bathyl to abyssal depths, the Nereides Ichnofacies assemblage traces are characteristic feeding traces showing regular patterns. These include Hemathoidea, which like Nereides is a looping surface trace, and the enigmatic Paleodictyon, which has a regular hexagonal pattern. The regular structure of the traces of this Ichnofacies is attributed to the scarcity of nutrients and the need to move efficiently. In shallower, nutrient-rich sediment, more random feeding structures are the norm. The presence of evidence of organisms disturbing sediment is known as bioturbation, a very common feature in sedimentary rocks. In fact, the absence of bioturbation in shallow marine deposits may be taken as an indicator of something unusual about the conditions, such as an anoxic seafloor. The intensity of bioturbation in a body of sediment is an indication of the number of animals living there and the length of time over which they were active. A scale of bioturbation intensity has been devised to allow comparison between deposits of different places. Grade 1, a few discrete traces. Grade 2, bioturbation affects less than 30% of the sediment, bedding is distinct. Grade 3, between 30 and 60% of the sediment is affected, bedding is distinct. Grade 4, 60 to 90% of the sediment is bioturbated, bedding is now indistinct. Grade 5, over 90% of the sediment is bioturbated and bedding is barely detectable. Grade 6, chaos. Sediment is totally reworked by bioturbation. It should be noted that when a body of sediment is wholly bioturbated, it can be difficult to recognize individual traces. Sometimes it's difficult to recognize that there was bioturbation at all. The sediment is simply structureless, with the only evidence of trace fossils being that the sediment appears to be slightly mottled or with patches of different grain sizes. Ichnofacies can be used as indicators of the degree of consolidation of the substrate, which can be used for analysis of a stratigraphic succession. Where rates of sedimentation are high, the seafloor is covered by loose sandy or muddy material, and a variety of ichnofacies occur according to water depth. The physical processes of tides, waves, and storms in marine environments define regions bounded by water depth changes. The beach foreshore is the highest energy depositional environment where waves break and tides regularly expose and cover the seabed. At this interface between the land and the sea, storms can periodically inundate low-lying coastal plains with seawater. Across the submerged shelf, waves, storms, and tidal currents affect the seabed to different depths, varying according to the range of the tides, the fetch of the waves, and the intensity of the storms. Sedimentary structures can be used as indicators of the effects of tidal currents, waves in shallow water, and storms in the offshore transition zone. Further clues about the environment of deposition are available from body fossils and trace fossils found in shelf sediments.
Say cheer.